Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Connie Berry.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. It's a beautiful day where I am.
That is awesome. Yeah, out here it's still about 50 degrees and raining constantly.
Oh, no. I'm sorry.
I'm glad to hear about other parts of the Midwest doing a bit better, though. So, can you tell me about your book?
Well, I have a series. It is set in the UK. It's called the Kate Hamilton Mystery Series, featuring an American antiques dealer with a gift for solving crimes. This is my latest book, which comes out on the 10th of May, is the fourth book. Kate is back in the Suffolk village of Long Barston. She is contemplating her future, if she has one, with Detective Inspector Tom Mallory. And in the meantime, she is helping her colleague, antiquities dealer Ivor Tweedy, organize an auction at Netherfield Sanatorium, which is a former Victorian insane asylum on the Suffolk coast. And among the fine collection of antiques that they're going to be auctioning off, there is a 15th-century painting by the Dutch master Jan Van Eyck. When a retired criminal inspector, Will Parker, is found dead, Kate begins to suspect that the halls of the sanatorium housed more than priceless art. She's actually shocked to learn that Will Parker was her very good friend Vivian Bunn's first boyfriend. They met in 1963 at a seaside holiday camp near the sanatorium, when along with three other young teenagers, they explored an abandoned house where a doctor and his wife had been found dead under bizarre circumstances. Now, when a second member of that childhood gang is found dead, and then a third, it becomes clear that the teens discovered more in that house than they realized. So what was the deadly secret that they unwittingly discovered, and can Kate figure it out before Vivian becomes the next victim?
Yes. And as I was saying to you before we got started recording, I have absolutely loved reading this book. It's so much fun to get caught up in the mystery of it all and trying to figure it out. And at least that's how my brain always works. Whenever I'm reading mysteries, I try and piece everything together, and I'm always wrong and I never come to an answer, but it's so much fun.
I'm so glad.
So I read that this book was actually inspired by an episode of This American Life, right?
Yes, it was, among other things. There are a number of real life inspirations for this particular book, but back in 2002, I was actually, I think, driving up through the Chicago area and going north into Wisconsin, and I was listening to This American Life, and it was an episode called Loon Lake. You can still pull it up, and it was about several young teenage boys in New Hampshire, and I'm actually forgetting why they were there. They were there with their parents for some reason for the summer, and they found an abandoned house, and they broke in and were just looking at all of the stuff that was left, things that people wouldn't normally leave, like wallets and personal possessions and documents. And they just spent that whole summer, exploring and looking at everything and trying to figure out what had happened to this family and why was the house just simply abandoned with all this stuff. And to me, it's just so captured my imagination, because that kind of a house, it's a little bit like a time capsule. Mm-hmm. So it's like part of the past, and I'm passionate about the past. I love history, but it's like a little piece of the past has somehow survived into the present, just intact. And so that was one of the inspirations for it. Another one was the Bill Bryson's book, On the Road to Little Dribbling. I don't know if you've read that or not, but it's very funny. All of his books are very, very funny. But he talks about being kind of a college-age guy. He was over in England, and he got a job at a mental institution called Holloway Sanatorium. That was a beautiful Victorian and private insane asylum that has since been turned into upscale townhouses and flats. I think it's called Virginia Water now, but I just started thinking about that, and it sent me into kind of a deep dive on Victorian mental institutions and how they worked and why some of them were so awful and others were just like almost like living in 4-star hotels.
Mm-hmm.
So those are a couple of the inspirations for the books. I had a lot of fun doing research and then putting it into fiction.
That is so interesting. Could you tell me a bit about what that research process was like, and what some of the resources that you went to were?
Today there's so much online. It's really fabulous. And when I was doing research, I discovered that during the Victorian era, there were a number of mental institutions that were built, just gorgeous, right at the same time as some of the old, what they call red brick universities in England, just beautiful, beautiful Victorian buildings. And in England at that time, if you were in the upper class and you had a family member with a mental problem, they would just stay home. You would have someone take care of them at home. The doctors would come, the people would take care of them. If you were a very, very poor person, you'd probably also keep them at home because you couldn't afford anything. And if they became dangerous or threatening, then they would be carted off to one of the public, what they called lunatic asylums at that time, and where the conditions were terrible. But these beautiful buildings were created for kind of the middle class, people who could afford to pay for specialized care. And they were developed along the lines of a new French theory called distraction therapy, where it was thought that your mind was kind of temporarily imbalanced because of the stresses of life. And if you could just, be taken away for a time to a beautiful environment where you could pursue your hobbies, where you could have pets, where you could have your servant come and serve you beautiful meals, the latest in plumbing, then gradually you would just be restored to normal life. So that was the theory. So these buildings exist, and then the question is, when they're no longer being used as hospitals, what do you do with them? Do you just tear them down? Well, no, they're part of English history, and so people are converting them into other uses.
And that was so fascinating to hear about in the book, and I loved how you blended the history in with it too. Those were some of my favorite parts, like how you were saying that you were really interested in the past in this, and I thought that was really cool how you would show how the past was all coming back to haunt them in some ways. So, as we've said, this is a mystery book, and there's a lot of moving parts to it. What was it like setting that up, like outlining wise?
Yeah, I use a tool called the plot clock, and I wish I could remember who developed that, but you can find it online. It just looks like a clock, and it's kind of divided into 4 segments, like noon to 3 p.m., 3 to 6, 6 to 9, 9 to midnight. And they're kind of like 4 acts in a book. And so there are major plot points. And what I try to do is I try to think through the major plot points. Not that those things don't change during the course of the writing, because they often do, but it's just a little bit like a roadmap. It gives me confidence to go ahead. And I don't necessarily know how I'm going to get from point A to point B to point C, but at least I know maybe 6 to 8 major plot points in the book in advance. But then, as I said, things change. Sometimes characters have their own ways of changing the story, and when that happens, it's usually the right thing to do, because I think that must come out of I always get the left brain, right brain thing confused, but I think is it the right brain that is the artistic side,
I believe so. Oh, also just a quick interjection. I just looked it up.
Okay.
And for anyone listening, and you too, the person who created the plot clock is Joyce Sweeney.
Oh yes, right, exactly. And she's given people permission to use it, so I'm glad to give her credit. But I think when the characters seem to take over, I think that must come out of my right brain rather than my left brain. And as I said, that's usually just the very thing that is right to do in that moment. So I wish it would happen more.
Yeah, that's something really interesting. I've had this show for a few years now, and I've also written a lot, and that's something that I've kind of discovered over the course of this journey is that the characters do kind of move on their own. And a lot of people that aren't writers think that that isn't real, or think that like it's ridiculous that we would say that, but it is so true, and it's really magical when it happens.
Yeah, I in the second book, which was the first book where we meet Ivor Tweedy, Kate is interviewing him about a friend of his who's been missing for many, many years. And so I'm just kind of typing along. I'm doing a dialogue between Kate and Ivor, and Kate is trying, and he says, well, he couldn't possibly have committed the murder. And Kate says, well, why are you so positive about that? And Ivor says, I'm just typing this. Ivor says, because he's dead. And I actually just stopped and I looked at the page and I thought, he is? Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, then I had to go back and kind of correct some things at the beginning to kind of lead up to that. But I hadn't planned that. I truly had not planned that. And just
that's such a great moment.
Yeah. So I just think Ivor knew best at that point, and I went with him because he knew.
That is so cool. Is that kind of thing something that you've had happen a lot throughout your writing journey, or did it start happening now as you've written more books?
It never happened to me until I began to write fiction. I shouldn't say that, because I did write a lot of stories when I was a child, and they were all fictional, and characters never said anything to me then. But after that, I started writing academically, and I started writing for business, and I did a lot of editing. So it was all nonfiction that I was doing. So when I started writing books is when I discovered that sometimes the characters will take a story in a path that you had not anticipated. And I wish I could say it happened all the time, because I think it's a good thing. Because again, I think it's that creative side of your brain taking over. So I wish it happened more. And if anybody has a secret to how you can get that to happen more, let me know, because I'd love to know that.
I would love to know too. It's always really is just the best moment when that happens.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned that you wrote a lot of short stories when you were a kid, but at what point did you know that you wanted to be a writer and have that be something that you did professionally?
Well, I didn't actually know that for quite a long time. Now looking back on it, I think just the fact that I have always written should have told me that, because writing isn't something you do, in my opinion. It is someone you are. And a writer has to write. There's, whether it's creating something fictionally or whether it's getting your thoughts and your feelings down on paper, or, creating something, you just do that. You just have to do that. A writer friend of mine was talking about, staying up late writing, and her husband had said to her, well, you don't have to do this. And I thought to myself, yeah, but if you're a writer, you actually do. Yeah. So I can't imagine not writing. I mean, if I never wrote another book for publication again, I would still be writing something, because that's just like a painter. A painter wants to put a visual image on a canvas. Mm-hmm. a writer wants to put words on paper. And I love words. To me, writing is an art. There's a rhythm in the language. There's a beauty in the language. We don't often think of the English language as being one of the beautiful languages. We think of French or Italian, but English is really a beautiful language, and it has a fascinating history. And the way words are put together can be just magical.
Oh my God, you are so absolutely right. I was just having a conversation kind of along these lines with my mom the other day. We were reading Anne Lamott's book, Bird by Bird. And
yes.
It's so excellent. But we were talking about, there's a chapter in there where she talks about writers that want to write to be published, like the kind of idea of like everyone wants to have a book published, but then people that are writers and that like feel this, like what you're saying, a writer kind of has to write. And I said to her, the time that I knew that I really wanted to pursue this as a career is when I realized that I don't care if no one ever reads another word that I write, but I'm still going to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, but just, and I'm sure you would agree with this, having written and then having someone read it and enjoy it is just pure pleasure.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I love to think of people getting enjoyment out of reading the story that I've created.
Me too. What was that like for you when you published your first book and it kind of was opened up to this broader stage and not just friends and family?
Yeah, well, I think that my kid, I have two boys who are grown up, and I think they were the most surprised of all. Like this isn't just mom's little hobby, she actually is going to have a book out there. But yeah, it's a feeling that you really can't describe. Molly, have you had a book published and held it in your hand?
I have not. I have a chapter published in a book called Pod Life, all about podcasters, and that was this very special moment getting to hold that. Like, oh my goodness, my words are here, but never a full book.
Yeah, well, it's just to get that book and to hold it in your hands, it's almost surreal, and then the other part of it is you think, oh no, I can't make any more changes. Because there always are things. I mean, I love revision. Writing, putting words on a blank page is really, really hard for me. It just takes so much concentration and effort, and I tend to be a little ADD. So, I'm always like thinking of something I should be doing other than writing. But once I have the words down on the page, even if they're horrible, which they usually are, the first draft, then the real fun for me begins, because I love to revise. And I could continue revising and polishing words forever. I used to joke that when my first book did come out, I would be at the bookstore with a red pencil trying to follow people home and trying to make some corrections, in the book. But it's a little scary, because at that point you can't change anything. And that book has to stand on its own. It kind of goes off into the world on its own, like sending your child off on the school bus for the first time and realizing you can't manipulate his day or her day. Your child has to do this, on his own. Same thing with a book,
Yeah, that makes complete sense. What is one of the most, or if you can share without it being too spoilery, what's one of the most dramatic changes that's happened for you in revision?
Oh, well, okay. So the most dramatic revision was my first book, which I started just kind of writing. I mean, it took me 10 years to get it published. I was still working full time. And so I would work on it, in the summers mostly, because I was teaching, and then also kind of on the weekends. But I was just kind of dibbling and dabbling along with it. And I had gotten some feedback. I'd let some writer friends that I knew read it, and they'd given me suggestions. And it was way too ambitious of a first book. I had way too many points of view. I think I might have had 6 or 7 points of view,
Oh,
which
wow.
is, I know, it's just ridiculous. And I had so many plot lines going, and I had too many characters, and it was written in third person. I was trying to make it third person close. But finally, when I retired, I decided, okay, I've been playing around with this thing. It's now or never. I am going to do whatever I need to do to make this book publishable. And so I took advice that I'd heard maybe 2, 3, 4 times, and I did this huge, massive revision. I took it from third person to first person.
Oh.
So I put it into Kate's voice. And interestingly enough, some of the comments that I had heard were, I'm not hearing Kate. And once I put it in her voice, to me, it was like a revelation, because all of a sudden, Kate was like a real person to me. And she a little bit took over, and she had opinions. And that was very fun. I also cut out all the points of view except Kate's. And then what I had to do was I had to go through all the other points of view and pick out things that needed to still be in the book. And it was amazing that there was almost nothing that I needed to add back in, which just told me that all those multiple points of view were not needed from the beginning. I took out about 8 characters. I added 2 in. I took out 3 or 4 storylines. I added in a storyline about Bonnie Prince Charlie. And once I got done with that massive revision, I finished it January 1st, I think it was 2017. I went to a writer's conference in Florida, and I had a chance to meet my editor at Crooked Lane Books, and she read some of my writing and then asked to see that full manuscript, and then on the basis of that gave me a 2-book contract. So it was well worth doing, but it was challenging, it was time consuming, it was sometimes painful to get rid of things that I had, just slaved over for way too long. But it was the right thing to do, obviously.
That's really incredible. Such a dramatic difference.
Yeah.
That was actually one of my favorite things in the book. You touched on it, was the sense of character and how you really did hear Kate's voice. It kept hitting me as I was reading it that everyone in it felt so real. My personal favorite was Vivian, but
oh yes, I love Vivian.
She's so much fun. But every character was like really stood out in their own way. What's it like for you, kind of getting in the heads of these characters, especially Kate, having it be in first person with every new book?
Yeah. That is fun. That is really fun. And I think the characters are, people often ask me, are you Kate? No, I'm not Kate. But Kate and I do share quite a few things in common. She's taller, slimmer, younger, and prettier than I am. But other than that, we both grew up in the antiques trade, and both had very, very wise mothers, although my mother isn't Kate's mother. My mother was much more emotional than Kate's mom. But developing characters is really, really fun, and giving them their own way of speaking. Vivian's a little bit of a drill sergeant. She cuts to the chase. She speaks in kind of an elliptical way. Lady Barbara, of course, is so genteel, just lovely, lovely woman. Ivor is hysterically funny, I think, because he keeps throwing out these non sequiturs, like, well, when I was on trial for reindeer rustling in Mongolia, but then he never tells the stories. He just goes on. Well, we don't have time for that now. And
it really gives you the full portrait of the character, though, having someone have all these stories and then just not sharing any of them. Like reading that, I immediately knew who he was.
But the thing is, with a series, a lot of the work comes up front because you have to develop them. But then as you go along through the series, you're carrying that small cast of characters along with you. You've got to add new ones in all the time, but you're kind of getting to know more and more about those characters. And again, sometimes it's the characters themselves that reveal more of themselves as you go along. That is really one of the joys, I think, of writing character-based fiction.
Yeah, for sure. I only have a couple more questions today, but one that I wanted to ask was, how did your time in the UK influence the writing of this book?
Oh, well, a lot, of course. So I was primed to be an Anglophile because I had Scottish grandparents. So from my earliest memories, they came to the United States as adults, but they kind of brought Scotland with them, so they kind of never left. They had a little community of Scottish people that they hung out with. They ate Scottish stuff. They kept, their same traditions. So when I went to visit them, it was in Buffalo, New York. It was kind of like going to Scotland, really.
That's really cool.
But then I went to, during college, I went to St. Clair's College at Oxford, and that's when I really fell under the spell of the British Isles. And of course, my majors in college were, and in graduate school too, English literature and English history. So that's just my thing. I just love that. And so it has been really a joy to be able to spend time mentally, especially during COVID, spend time where I love to be. My husband and I traveled to the UK a lot. We were just there for 3 weeks in October, and we go usually once or twice a year. And that's partly research trip, but just partly kind of getting my top up of Britain.
That is so cool. Yeah. I also love the UK, and behind me, I know the people listening to this can't hear it, but you can see it a little bit. There's a photo from, I think it's King's Cross, but it might not be. We can't remember, but that's a photo my mom took when we were in London.
Wonderful. Yeah.
And it was really fun reading this book because I kind of felt transported back there. And like you said, during COVID, that's a nice break, All right. Well, it has been an absolute joy to talk to you today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you, Molly. I have loved talking to you too. We have a lot in common.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation. My last question is, what do you have coming up?
I am actually working on a couple. Well, right now, what I'm doing mostly is launch stuff. So because my book comes out on the 10th, I'm doing a lot of writing of articles and things like that. But I'm also working on a possible new Kate book, fifth Kate book. And also I've been developing a new series, which is going to be an historical set in Hampshire in the mid-Victorian era, which I'm very excited about.
That sounds awesome. Well, I will definitely be reading that. Good luck with everything, with all the releases and writing and anything to come. Everyone, please go out and read this book and support her in any way possible.
Thank
For
you.
Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Connie Berry.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after, the end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.